Massive wildfires broke out in California and Oregon over the weekend as several states reached consistent triple-digit temperatures. At the same time, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen announced she is planning to meet with the heads of multilateral development banks to push them on taking stronger steps on climate change, part of her long-term plan to more effectively mobilize private capital towards environmental efforts.
Joining us to discuss is Illinois Congressman Sean Casten. Welcome, Congressman. Thanks so much for being here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Let's just start off with your reaction to the wildfires that have broken out over the weekend and how those sort of come into play with the work that you're doing on this issue.
The wildfires are exactly what scientists have been warning us is going to happen. The heat domes, the derechos, the flooding, this is all the new normal, and it's getting worse more quickly every year. We have an obligation to future generations to fix this, but we also have an opportunity because anything we do to convert to cleaner energy sources is also a conversion to cheaper energy sources. I spent 16 years before I came to Congress running clean energy companies, and I only sold those projects because people were selfish. They wanted to pay less for energy. So we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity and an obligation, and let's act.
How do you feel that either the bipartisan infrastructure package or the reconciliation package being put together by Democrats is dealing with clean energy and climate tech in general?
It is moving in the right direction. When I met with President Biden last week, my conversation with him was that what is scientifically necessary exceeds what any of us think of as politically possible right now, and we need to make sure to close that gap. So it's positive. I think part of the challenge we have is that in the conversion to a cheaper economy, we're creating a massive wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers. And that, not surprisingly, is going to be resisted by folks who represent the energy producing parts of the country, which, at least in the current political configuration, is a Republican-Democratic issue. But it's important to understand that as long as we put the interests of American citizens and American consumers first, we can get this done. We just have to keep pushing.
In your conversation with President Biden, where did you get the sense that this ranks on his list of priorities?
I have no doubt that it's extremely important. I think the challenge that we're all struggling with is that the scale of what needs to be done exceeds what we can do just in the federal government. And, indeed, we've seen the private sector invest massive amounts of money in our economy before. In the energy sector, when we deregulated the power grid, we built 200,000 megawatts of generation, mostly private sector, in a span of about 10 years. We can do it again. The tools that we have to incentivize the private sector don't fit very well into a reconciliation model because the reconciliation model is limited to federal spending. So, things like removing the subsidies to the fossil fuel sector, things like creating a standard a single permitting agency for new transmission. Those are all things that I've been personally focused on. We can do those, but they don't fit really well into reconciliation. And so in the conversations I've had with Biden and other folks in the White House, it's this question of how do we do what is good for the economy, what is good for the private sector, what's necessary scientifically, if our tool is only limited to a reconciliation model. And we don't have all the answers to that, but we got good people working on it.
So according to a study by Stanford University, pollution reductions between 1999 and 2019 contributed to approximately 20% of the increase in corn and soybean yield gains. That's about $5 billion per year. Congressman, how aware would you say your colleagues are of the gap between what they believe is politically possible and what scientists say is just simply necessary to stave off collapse?
I think there are some of us who are at a very high reading level. There are some of us who are at a kindergarten reading level. There's a PhD level problem. And that's okay, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on criminal justice reform. We all bring our own expertise. So I think there is an awareness. That Stanford study you cite, interestingly enough, was forwarded to me by my colleague Bill Foster earlier last week, and there's been a lot of chatter among my colleagues about that. So there certainly is an awareness on that. Do keep in mind in that study, though, that study about the impact of pollution on plants has already been done thousands of times with the impact of pollution on people. If you live downwind of a coal plant, you are much more likely to die early. You are much more likely to have asthma. And estimates that Harvard, that the Army Corps of Engineers have done, is that the downwind costs of that premature fatality and health are equal roughly to the entire revenue of the coal industry. So in other words, we are subsidizing, the coal industry is getting 100% subsidy from Medicaid. What in the name of Adam Smith are we doing, right? Let's tie these things together and really embrace capitalism and factor these externalities in, and then take off the emergency brake and drive this car that is our economy forward as fast as we can.
Yeah, I think embracing the capitalist part of it is going to make that kind of a hard sell to the far left, who is doing a lot of work on this issue as well. But the Biden administration's clean energy plan, let's talk about that, would require utilities to increase the amount of clean energy they use, such as solar and wind, and it would cut emissions and save an estimated 317,500 lives. That's a very specific number, Congressman. Do you think this goes far enough, or how much do you think how much of a dent in the work that needs to be done from your perspective does this plan make?
Well, look, as I said before, it is directionally right. The challenge, I sit on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. We came out with a report last year to figure out how to do what is scientifically necessary. We looked at every bill that had been introduced in the last session that was consistent with what was scientifically necessary. Not that it passed out of committee, not that it passed on the floor, that had been introduced. And then we got some outside experts to say, if we do all of these, how close do we get to what we need done? And the answer was we get about 80% of the way there. And that's both remarkable in the sense that it gave us a roadmap for how to get most of the way there. And it's also, if we're honest, is a little bit depressing, because what it says is that we are constrained not by technology, we are constrained not by capital, we are constrained not by talent, we are constrained by our ambition. And so within the Biden plan, we're going in the right direction, but we really need to have, and I've talked with the White House about this as well, we need a scorekeeper who's going to go through and say, how much CO2 are we going to reduce? How quickly? What is going to be the impact on the economy? We know people who did it because we did it in the climate economy. And let's have that scoreboard so that we are honest about whether we're doing what's sufficient.
So Viktor Frankl has famously talked about what he dubbed the delusion of reprieve, which is that even when people are informed and have evidence that they're about to head into something apocalyptic, either personally or more generally, they just simply don't believe it until it actually happens. Have you noticed the heat dome or anything else cracking that delusion of reprieve, or is that delusion still holding strong?
For some, yes. For some, no. I think the key, and I got to come back to my private sector experience. When I was selling clean energy projects, and I sold projects to, companies as diverse as Kodak and Dow Chemical and, steel manufacturers, paper mills, lumber mills, hospitals, universities. With one exception, I don't ever remember selling that project because someone had to first be convinced that climate change mattered, that the world was changing, and they had an obligation to fix it. On the other hand, I sold all those by telling people, do you want more reliable energy? Well, we've got the opportunity to make some clean, renewable energy on site. That was pretty appealing to them. Do you want cheaper energy? Well, I've got the ability to make energy on site that you don't have to pay for fuel. And I think if we speak to people in the language that they care about, do you care about national security? Do you care about health? Do you care about the economy? These are all good things to do. And where we have seen things pushing, it's been because people understand that it's in their self-interest. Why are so many people buying electric vehicles right now? Some are buying them for moral reasons. A lot of them are buying them because they're really fun to drive. Right? Right? And that's okay. So yes, there's some awareness on the climate side, but we have to use every tool in our arsenal and just get people to understand that it's in your own selfish self-interest to pay less for energy. Let's start doing it.
And you had said that if you add up all the bills that have been introduced, the scientists said that gets you only to 80% of the way there. Have you thought about introducing a 100% bill? Like here is what would actually have to happen?
Well, so I should clarify what we did. And 100%, I really want to stress, any politician who stands up and says, I will get to zero carbon by year X, if you can't tell me how we're going to make steel, how we're going to make fertilizer, how we're going to make cement, that's as credible as saying we're going to eliminate the deficit by year X. But the path really matters, and there are some of these that are going to take R&D efforts. Now, to be fair about the analysis we did in the Climate Committee report, we quantified every reduction in carbon that was quantifiable. So, for example, if we create an investment tax credit for wind, if we have a clean energy standard, if we, electrify vehicle fleets, those are quantifiable impacts. We didn't quantify ones that are a little harder to quantify. So, for example, I have a bill that we passed on the House floor to create consistent carbon disclosure rules for public companies so that investors who care about CO2 reduction can better allocate their capital. I think anybody who understands markets would suggest that more transparency will provide a more efficient allocation of capital and will lower the effective cost of equity and debt to those who want to reduce CO2. That's got to increase further CO2 reductions, but it's really hard to quantify. So I think it's entirely possible that we did actually have enough to get to 100%, but of the quantifiable ones, we could only see our path to 80%. So we're going to have to do all those. And the answer is no, because I don't have the hubris to say that I'm going to, from my office, write a bill that will affect the transportation sector, the building sector, the electric sector, the agriculture sector, and, by the way, all of our foreign relations. We have to move on all those fronts.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you all for taking the time.
Really appreciate it. And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.